spread across the globe. So some are able to make it today. So on the call is Jacob Eisler, who's also at University of Southampton with me, and Joe Shaw at Edinburgh. And we also on our editorial team have Val Napoleon, who's based at University of Victoria in Canada, and Antje Wiener, who was the founding editor of Global Constitutionalism 10 years ago now, and she is based in Hamburg. And Val and Antje aren't able to make the call this morning, but they'll try to make some of the other sessions throughout the next 2 days. So just a little bit of housekeeping when we begin. I think it seems like most people have muted themselves, but just a reminder to mute yourself if you're not talking, just as I think we all know now how these devices all work. Also, if it gets, Teams has gotten a little bit better over the last few years, but if we got a large crowd and it gets a little unstable, if you're not talking, it might also help to turn your camera off too. That can help at times as well. So this is our second virtual Scholars Workshop, and actually our fourth iteration of the Scholars Workshop at Global Constitutionalism. So we started these a few years ago for a couple of reasons. And one was to try to kind of just primarily networking, to try to help scholars in this interdisciplinary field meet each other, because we are an interdisciplinary journal drawing on people from philosophy, law, political science, international relations. There are not many conferences where all of those fields usually overlap. So our first thought was to have create an annual space in the summertime where scholars could come and meet. Secondly was essentially kind of obviously self-promotional. It was a way to kind of help publicize the journal and kind of get our name out there. And then third, while it's not exclusively targeted to junior scholars, part of the impetus for the workshop was to provide a space where early career researchers could get a bit more detailed feedback on submitting to the journal. So because this is a bit virtual, a lot of this we'd actually just do kind of in the first couple of years in kind of conversations during the breaks, but that's a little trickier to do virtually. So I might kind of, as chair's prerogative for the next few minutes, just kind of highlight how and why you might want to submit your work to Global Constitutionalism. So I think what we're going to do is an editor is going to be a discussant for each of the panels, and then those editors have also agreed to kind of send some comments to the participants afterwards, just a little bit of feedback. And the feedback here is less geared at kind of, I mean, there'll be a bit obviously kind of responding to the papers in a normal role, but it'll be a bit more kind of feedback towards what you might want to do if you want to submit this piece to Global Constitutionalism. There's no requirement that you do that for participating in the workshop, but obviously we hope that you would kind of think about submitting your work to us. And so I'll kind of give, I may come back to this later on over the course of the next 2 days, but I'll kind of give from my perspective as an editor the 3 reasons why papers get rejected. And the first thing to note is that it's more likely than not when you submit to any peer-reviewed journal that your paper will be rejected than accepted. And it's taken me as a scholar a good 15 years to kind of work myself up to this defeatist position. But essentially, I've kind of got to the point now where you should almost accept rejection in a certain sense. But there's things you can do as an author to kind of improve your odds, right? So from my experience, and maybe Joe and Jacob can kind of kick in if they have other suggestions on this. The first, from our perspective, is what I would call fit, that often, and this is often a case of desk reject, because we're an interdisciplinary journal, sometimes stuff that's not quite within our wheelhouse gets submitted to us, and then we have to make a call. So sometimes it's pretty easy. It's just on, say, like metaphysics or some completely different topic that has nothing to do with global constitutionalism. That's a very easy desk reject. The bigger one that I think happens on our end is what I would call comparative constitutionalism as opposed to global constitutionalism. And so what I mean by that is it's often a case of a single country that isn't speaking to kind of broader global issues of constitutionalism across time and space, appealing to global norms, speaking to international public law, speaking to kind of broader issues in political philosophy. Often a paper could be restructured so that it does speak to those issues, but if a paper is simply about one case in one country, it's probably a better fit for a journal that's explicitly comparative constitutional. I think ICON is often kind of the closest one to us for that, but there's other good kind of either regional or local comparative constitutional journals. So it might be fit. And then the question, of course, if you as an author is, should you kind of repackage your paper for GlobeCon, or is it perhaps kind of going to a better journal? I think the other two things, and this kind of happens more at the reviewer stage, where things get rejected by reviewers, is lack of engagement with the literature. And so what happens here is, because we are an interdisciplinary journal, your paper is likely to be sent out both to somebody in law and to somebody in political science, international relations, or philosophy. And so it may be that your paper speaks the relevant literature in law, but if a reviewer in political science gets it, they may say, well, you haven't cited these 20 things on kind of the rule of law debates over the last 20 years that are key texts. So being kind of mindful of what you cite, and I think before you submit, perhaps doing a check to see, am I only citing people from a law discipline as opposed to also the other disciplines in politics and international relations? And then the other quick check I'd suggest, there's no requirement that you cite stuff from Global Constitutionalism. We don't kind of use that as an explicit screen. But I think it's a good clue that if you're submitting something, and this is to any journal, I would say, that if you're not citing stuff from the journal you're submitting it to, you might want to ask yourself why, and if then that your piece is the best fit. So I would say if you're writing whatever your paper's on, my other bit of advice would be to kind of just at least take an hour just to go through the recent back catalog of whatever journal you're submitting to, and identify papers that have been published there in the recent past that are that are close to your paper's topic, and then see if you should cite them, but also look at the literatures they're citing and see if there's an overlap there. And then if the answer is no, that might give you kind of one of two clues. Perhaps you should be submitting to a different journal, or perhaps you need to cite those literatures. Because just speaking as an editor here, our biggest challenge is often to get peer reviewers. And the obvious reviewer pool is people who published with us recently, because I don't say they owe it. Well, actually, they do owe us something because we published their stuff. So I feel like they will be very quickly the first port of call. And so it's quite likely if you're writing on something to do with rule of law, and we just had a symposium on rule of law that came out last issue, probably those people would be likely people to be hit up to be reviewers. So partly that's pragmatic, but it's also, are you then engaging with the relevant literature? And the third thing I think is what I call the so what question, which there's different ways of phrasing this, but often, and I kind of include myself in this, we kind of get tunnel vision, we get very excited about our topic, we get very into the weeds, we have great analysis, all the evidence is there, we've cited everything fine, but there needs to be kind of a clear conclusion that explains why this paper's findings are significant. And significant means like, what's the broader contribution to the literature the paper's making, right? So how are you advancing our understanding of the larger questions, and what larger questions is the paper speaking to? And why, and in our particular case, why would readers of Global Constitutionalism, so people who publish in our journal, people who kind of publish broadly in the world of kind of international public law and comparative law, care about this issue? And I think in most cases, the paper probably has that implicitly, and it's probably clear to the author, but it's often not clear to the editors or reviewers. So I think taking a bit of time and writing out a paragraph or two, and that can either be, that actually should appear both in the introduction and conclusion, perhaps flagged one or two other places in the main body, but taking a little bit of time to unpack that, I think also increases your chances of getting accepted. So that's kind of the general advice that I wanted to flag at the outset of the workshop today. I think in terms of the procedures, I think, there are pros and cons, obviously, to going online. I think the big pro, as we were discussing before, is that we're able to bring people from all over the world together, from different time zones. And actually, our first panel, if I'm correct at the moment, we have, the papers kind of speak globally. So we have a paper that's talking about Bougainville in Papua New Guinea, a second paper that's talking about constitutional questions in Colombia, and a third paper talking about the Western Balkans. So we kind of right off the bat get to kind of cover the full global constitutional questions. So I think, Aige, do you have anything you want to add from kind of the hosting mechanical perspectives, or should we just kind of get right in here?
I think, thank you for all these opening remarks, Jonathan. I think we can start just to say, as you said, you will as you know from the program, we will have 3 papers, and then we will have question and answer session. So please, all you feel free to add your questions or comments, to add your contribution by typing them into the chat box or raising your hands. But for now, please, unless you are speaking or commenting, please mute yourself. And we are, as you know, recording. All the recordings will be provided in our channel and you will get informed about it too. So now I think we can start. Thank you again for being here and welcome. Hope you will all enjoy the event. So Sebastian, it's yours. Please, you can start.
Okay, thank you. Just a question, it's 15 minutes, right, for my talk?
Yes, indeed, yes.
Okay. So I will have my timer here. Okay, the title of my talk is Indigenous Peoples and Multiculturalism. Two perspectives about Indigenous peoples and multiculturalism. And I would like to start with mentioning very briefly a case that occurred in 1998 in Colombia, when the Constitutional Court decided what is come to be known as the Arhuaco case. So the Arhuaco are an indigenous people from the North Colombia with a population, a small group, 35,000 members, the majority of which live in the reservation, which is a self-determining administrative unit. So what happened there is that some members of the community started to convert into Christianism. And the authorities of the community decided that this was posing a threat to the cultural integrity and to the preservation of the culture. So they decided to restrict the freedom of religion of these Christians among them. So Christians in the community protest, and they decided to take this to the national courts. So the case goes all the way down to the Constitutional Court, and they sit with the magistrates, with the authorities of the community, and the court finally decides against the Christian minority in the community. So the Constitutional Court says the authorities of the community are right in thinking that these conversions pose a threat to the cultural preservation of the community, and they have the right to take these kind of measures. So since then up to today, in indigenous reservations, there is no need to protect the value of equal freedom of religion or equal freedom of conscience. So if we look at this kind of case, which by the way is common in several Latin American countries, I would say like the majority of Latin American countries are going through this direction. If we look at these kind of decisions from the lenses of the, let's say, mainstream political theory of multiculturalism, we would be very critical of this decision. Liberal egalitarian multiculturalists often call these kind of decisions as instances of approval of internal restrictions. So internal restrictions are measures taken by the authorities of a local community restricting individual rights of the members of the community on the grounds that these measures are going to be for the sake of preservation of the culture, preservation of cultural integrity, and these decisions obviously are against the will of these people who suffer these restrictions of individual freedom. Liberal egalitarian multiculturalism then reject these kind of internal restrictions, and in contrast, they approve of what they call external protections. So external protections are measures taken to protect the culture of a group against influences that come from outside the group, not against influence or change that comes from inside the group. So it doesn't restrict the individual freedom of the members of the community, but it sort of creates protections against influences from outside the community. So liberal egalitarian multiculturalists say, well, these kind of restrictions, these kind of protections from the outside of the group, they do not restrict individual freedom, and therefore they are legitimate. So if we look at how liberal egalitarian multiculturalism would judge from a normative perspective what happened in Colombia, they would say, well, this was a case of internal restrictions, and therefore it is illegitimate from a, let's say, liberal egalitarian perspective. So what I want to do in this article is to offer a different perspective from which we can sort of assess from a normative point of view this kind of decision that occurred in Colombia. And I do that by taking inspiration in the political philosopher Iris Marion Young and her characterization of what she calls cultural imperialism. So famously, she describes 5 phases of oppression, and one of these is cultural imperialism. Her definition of cultural imperialism consists of the universalization of a dominant group experience and culture and its establishment of it as the norm. So the hegemonic culture or the hegemonic group sort of defines what is normal, and then everybody has to follow that. So minority cultures find themselves in this situation in which they have to kind of adjust to what the hegemonic culture sort of imposes. And this doesn't have to be kind of intentional, it just happens. You know, like it goes, as they are the majority hegemonic group, what they consider to be normal is going to be assumed to be normal for the minority groups. So Iris Young says this generates the injustice of cultural imperialism because it situates minority cultures into the troubled situation in which they have kind of divergent normative paths. On the one hand, they feel the pressure to conform to the norms of the majority, and on the other hand, they feel the pressure to conform to their own norms. So they sort of have to decide between these 2 paths, and the fact that they have to decide in these 2 paths, and the fact that this decision is kind of socially constructed, constitutes an injustice. So what I want to suggest with this article is that this is exactly what is happening with the Arhuaco people. And this kind of situation of cultural imperialism is what actually the Colombian Constitutional Court tried to reverse, to reverse this kind of injustice in which indigenous peoples situate in countries like Colombia. And I try to do this by trying to show that the sort of the court was to, by granting the Arhuaco people the right to decide not to follow the political value of equal freedom of conscience, what they are trying to say is, well, the Colombian state doesn't really have full sovereignty over indigenous peoples. And the fact that so far, historically, the country has not recognized that it doesn't have full sovereignty over indigenous peoples constitutes an illegitimate assumption. So what I want to defend is that from the perspective of recognizing the lack of legitimate state sovereignty over indigenous peoples, the question about the permissibility of internal restrictions balances in favor of the decision reached in the case I mentioned at the beginning. According to this perspective, the state acquires legitimacy over indigenous peoples upon the acknowledgement of limited state sovereignty over indigenous peoples. So this is understood as a mechanism to kind of right the wrong of the unjustified assumption made by ethnic elites that they are entitled to govern over the territory demarcated by state borders, which includes indigenous peoples. So the recognition of self-determination rights undoes this assumption, because it isn't anymore the case that ethnic elites are presumed to be entitled to govern over indigenous peoples. And consequently, indigenous peoples are not presumed to have the obligation to obey the authority of the state. So in order to get a kind of a grasp of the wrong that was righted with the acknowledgement of self-determination rights, it is useful to see the dimension of the injustice involved in the form of entitlement I mentioned. As I take it, the wrong corrected was the injustice of cultural imperialism. So let's see briefly a little bit of the history of the relationship between indigenous peoples and the Colombian state. The Colombian state as it is independent from the Spanish Empire, so like 19th century onwards. So starting in the 19th century, Colombian nation building project consisted of envisaging a linguistic, cultural, racial homogeneity, which included a process of whitening, that is a process that sought to de-Indianize and de-Africanize the country over several generations through genetic assimilation into a vigorously expanding white population. This process involved moralizing the Indian character by resocialization through education and religious indoctrination. During the first decades of the 20th century, this process of whitening was in decay, but it was replaced by a project of nation building that promoted what in Latin America, kind of the ideology that quite common in Latin America, mestiçage. So the idea that Latin American countries are kind of a melting, it's not a melting pot, it's kind of a mixture of all ethnic groups in the country. So it's one single group, ethnic group, which again kind of denies the kind of presence of indigenous ethnic groups. The conservative constitution of 1886, so this is the previous constitution that was enforced in Colombia over almost 1 century, it determined the shape of Colombian institutions until it was replaced by the multicultural constitution, which is the constitution of 1991, the one which is in force right now. So that one was a centralist and Catholic-oriented constitution, permissive of laws that classify indigenous peoples by the degree of savageness and attributed them liability according to their degree of savageness and degree of agency. According to the anthropologist Brooke Larson, it depicted a more gradualist approach to the civilizing project, which included legal protections to reservations, so savage Indians could be set apart as minors in need of state protection and tutelage. Paradoxically, this measure, the creation of these reservations created a process of re-Indianization. So it was the opposite of what happened in the 19th century, in the previous century, and land claims for the creation of new reservations increased, as long as there was this explicit indigenous identity. Ultimately, this process seems to have empowered indigenous peoples in such a way that they forced their way into the center of the nation's constitutional politics that culminated in the Multicultural Constitution of 1991. So with these considerations about the relationship of cultural imperialism between the Colombian state and its indigenous population, we can actually see from a different perspective what was at stake in the decision in Arhuaco. So if we look at this kind of decision as a case that poses the question that liberal egalitarian multiculturalists often ask, that is, should the liberal state tolerate illiberal practices within its cultural minorities, then the answer obviously would be, well, it shouldn't, because internal restrictions are illegitimate restrictions to individual rights. But what I'm trying to propose in this article is, well, if we look from the perspective of the injustice of cultural imperialism and from the demand that it asked us to follow, that we should revise the assumption that ethnic elites have a authority to rule over indigenous peoples, then we might look at different lenses. We can see that what the Constitutional Court was doing was actually trying to right this wrong of the presupposition of this authority of ethnic elites over indigenous peoples. So just to conclude, I think this is kind of a common practice in Colombian constitutional decisions. But if we look at other Latin American countries, this is kind of a tendency they are following. So if we analyze kind of Latin American multiculturalism from this perspective that I'm trying to offer here, we can see that we wouldn't be so quick in dismissing it as illegitimate as liberal multiculturalism might be, and we might have kind of a kind of theoretical basis to build up kind of this form of constitutional practice. And just as a last remark, I have the impression that it's actually going to keep happening in the region. So as you might know, maybe you don't know, you're not that aware of that, Chile is in the process of constitution building. And if you look at the social movement that created that took the country to that situation, you could see the flags of indigenous peoples. You could see wide support for indigenous peoples who have been suffering, among others, the injustice of cultural imperialism. So I would say, well, this is something that is going to keep happening, and probably, and I'm curious to know, like, if they, as it seems it's going to happen, if they are going to have this kind of, they're going to preserve this tendency, and if it's so, we shouldn't be so quick saying, well, this is not liberal, this is not according to liberal multicultural political theory. Maybe we could just try to see that this is basically righting the wrong of cultural imperialism that has been kind of common practice in the region. So with this remark, I finish my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for the presentation. And we will follow with the next presentation by Vito. Vito, are you ready to start?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, it's great. You can
Okay,
start.
cool. Give me a second. I have to switch up something. All right. Okay, cool. Okay, thank you very much for having me. And I'm teaching legal theories and comparative law in Australia. But most of my research work is on national identity, or the role of nationalism in constitutional democracies. So, by the way, when I started a few years ago with my PhD, my mentor said I should get rid of that idea that nationalism and national identity has to do with constitutionalism, because I will never publish anything on it. And I should move on to criminal law, which would be a much better way to start a career. And obviously I resisted that. So for the past 20 years, I've been writing about the role of national identities. And 2 years ago, I finished a book on regionalism, which was dealing with cases around the world, but they were what I would call vanilla cases. So cases in which there were a form of deliberations, there were negotiations. And I left out the cases which my publisher thought were too hot. So I didn't write anything about Northern Ireland. I didn't write anything, well, very little about Quebec or Catalonia and the Basque countries. And so for the past 2 years, in the middle of my teaching breaks, I've been writing about hot cases. And the case of Bougainville probably is one of the hottest of all the cases, because the process of constitutional decentralization came after a civil war, effectively. And why Bougainville and the relation to PNG, the Papua New Guinea, is, I think, an interesting case, or has global implications for these journals, is because the models they are using, the model they've been using to solve the conflict, and the model that will change the future of the regions and the PNG, is based on a hybrid system which focuses on deliberations. So creating a large base consensus, which is part of customary law in the Pacific. So this is not distinctive of Bougainville. You might find the similar situations in all the islands, the Solomon Islands, on Samoa, and etc. Now, so this is the interesting bit. How a form of what they call the customary consensus has become one of the what they call drivers of changes for the constitutional systems in PNGs. I think is interesting because that is one of the elements, one of the drivers of change which affect all all the Pacific nations, or not, or most part of the Pacific nations. So said that, I want to let me tell you a little bit what's happened with the Bougainville and the civil wars, and now how my paper trying to explain the process of decentralizations of the regions. So the reason the war started, the official reason, what everybody thought it was started, has to do with the mining process. So the mining process was a contested process in Bougainville, producing in theory a lot of revenues, which was which were sent to PNG, and that created a lot of animosity. The mining process was run by Rio Tinto, an Australian company, well, effectively a British company, but the subsidiary was embedded in Australia. And that created a lot of tensions between the locals and the Australian authorities in general. Bougainville wanted independence. They had a referendum, and PNG reacted with with repressions. And then they did something unique on the study of regionalism. What the civil war degenerated to a point in which PNG refused to withdraw from the regions. So this is something you think, well, this is very strange. So a state will refuse to consider a region as part of their own territory. And that's what happened. They create a blockade, a naval and sea blockade around the islands. And again, this is a little bit odd, but effectively there are many areas in Europe, if you think about Sicily, and certainly is the situation in Northern Ireland, or extreme situations like the Israeli military occupations of Arab territories, which are very similar, in which the state basically refused to consider that particular region as part of the normal system of governance. The process of normalizations follow a stalemate. So the anarchy which follows, so the different fighting within the regions, within a region of Bougainville, produces situations in which, well, it was a humanitarian disaster, but it was also clear that the government couldn't find a correspondent. They couldn't find someone that they could talk in order to create a normalizations. And here is where my paper effectively starts. What are the drivers of change? What changed the situations? What make this process, which was on the edge of desperations, in a process of decentralizations, which led to a constitutional reforms. Now Bougainville is an autonomous region. There is a referendum. There is a process for independence. And I said there are three different factors. The first one is the economy. I will not spend too much time on it, but basically the fact that both parties refused to consider the economy one of the factors was relevant. So there is no fight over resources. The second element which is the most interesting, is the hybridizations, part of the hybridizations of the institutions. So effectively, the structure of the society is a patriarchal, but the ownership of the land in PNG passed through the matriarchal line. So all the property is owned by females. Now, they have a particular roles because they are supposed to be the mediators. They are the ones, there is the gender which should reduce the fight within the community and the interaction between different communities. When that is not possible, men take over and there is violence. Finally, when there is a stalemate, women take over the process of negotiations again. Now, over the period which followed the stalemate, a network of women which managed to produce, to form consensus within the different villages, and then move that consensus by moving it across different villages, create a political capital, which was the basis for the development of a negotiation process with the PNG authorities. That is quite distinctive now. So it's not uncommon for the Pacific nations to have ownership pass through the matriarchal line, because normally the most man goes out fishing, and so that process has created situations in which the management of resources and the political management of those resources is left to women. That things is attached to how decisions are taken or are managed within the political institutions or the traditional political institutions in the different villages. Issues are discussed in a way which is very similar to open deliberative democracy. So both women and men discuss what are the issues, and the constitution created institutions of which is called the Council of the Elders. But crucially, the decisions are reached only if there is full consensus. So we not 51% win, and that is the decision taken. There must be consensus in the full Habermasian way. There should be deliberations, and if there is no consensus, there is not agreement, the process stops and it started it again. So during the phase which led to the consultation process, what the PNG authorities were dealing with is a network of deliberative activity, which has taken a very, very long time, but at the end form a clear plan for the decentralization of the island, a clear constitutional process of decentralizations, which was linked to independence. Now, I don't know how many of you are interested on deliberative democracies, or we have spent writing. I spent quite a bit of time writing about Habermas and his constitutional patriotism, but this is exceptional. It's making me smile every day that I come out with a constitutional patriotism which was basic on anthropological reasons instead of normative reasons. So those villages will produce consent, and that consent will perceive as a real consent, so binding everybody if everybody agreed. Now, James Stanley, in his book on the multinationalism, produced this idea of what affect us should be agreed on. And we have this series of villages, few 100,000 people in the middle of the Pacific, who managed to produce that process in a long and widely contested activities. The third driver of change, which was how the entire process of bottom-up democracy has been transformed in institutions, is interesting per se, but I will not spend too much time on the technical element. It just happened that the result of this is that a system, PNGs adopt basically the UK constitutional system before devolutions, create a constitutional reform in which a regions become special, so similar to Scotland. But the process was possible thanks to a distinctive activities of women and the role of the traditional woman in societies. So, which I think, repeating the situations again because which is quite an interesting aspect, which is not considered in many liberal societies, for instance. So for the past 2 years, I've been working on the role of genders on public law, and there is very little analysis in the role of genders on public law. And particularly, it's very difficult to point the finger and say, well, this is a gender-specific element. There is an element that women have on negotiation. There is an element to bring peace. There is an element of finding mediations where men might go for egos. There is a lot of speculative analysis about this, but there are very little cases which show that this is happening in practice. And in the case of Bougainville, we have these situations in which the role of the women of peacemakers, of negotiations makers, are being used on the deliberative stage and in the formation of consensus, which will lead to the referendum. And the last bit, which is again has to do with show evidence of this distinctive role, which is part of customary law, but that has been transformed in public law, is on which happened by, we don't know. I don't know if it's happened by mistake, but let's call it serendipity. During the negotiation process, in which the different group of individuals were representing the individuals who were controlling the island and the PNG authority, they couldn't meet in either PNG or in Bougainville, because for a period of time, when they were trying to do that, they were trying also to kill each other, which was not a proxy for good negotiations. And so they meet in New Zealand. That was first element. They were met by Maori, and that created strange situations. It was the first time probably that the both people in Bougainville and PNG saw that three customaries, people who were bearing the customary law, so the Maoris, were also part of the public law systems. Okay, so that was the first element. When the process finished, the New Zealand and Australia sent troops to guarantee peace. And I don't know if it was by mistakes, but a large group of those peace troops were women. That changed completely the attitude of the PNG, of the people in both in PNG and Bougainville, but particularly in Bougainville, because the women are the peacekeepers, the real peacekeeper in the societies. And so what a process which has been failing for almost a decade was perceived successful because the institutions were represented by women. And it did happen that a large group of those women were also Maori. So there was a combination of there was an increased trust on the process, which for a long period of time saw the role of white. They use the term Pacheca as a form of cultural imperialism, effectively. So that basically is what's happened there. And the claim, which I try to make, is this. So the first claim is that what's happened there is something quite extraordinary, because we see evidence of the ability to create hybrid connections between customary practices and public law institutions. There is also another element of the role of gender. We have the direct evidence from customary law that women have a particular role in forming a political community and to form consensus. And the last bit, which is, I don't know, probably just a quirk, but I found it quite interesting, that we have a form of deliberative democracies, which produce a large amount of consensus, which is not based on normative or Kantian analysis. It's just based on the assumptions that you have to respect the will of the others. You cannot construct the situations in which we are the majority, you have to do what we want you to do. You have to construct the conditions that that make those who are defeated, or they to accept that is the process, or the best process for the common good of everybody. And that again is a negative aspect on the development of constitutional relations between PNG and Bougainville, because it takes a very long time, and that had a cost. And that's it. That's my paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vito, for this interesting presentation. And now we will follow to the third and the last presentation by Andy. And also, I just want to say hello to our editor, Antje, who joined just us. So Jonathan mentioned all the editors. She wasn't here. Welcome, Antje, and we can follow with Andy's presentation now. You have 15 minutes, Andy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. So this paper, it's a part of an ongoing research that I'm doing on the rule of law in the Western Balkans. So to give you a bit of context, in 2018, the EU published the enlargement strategy for the Western Balkans, and it sort of provided a roadmap for the future enlargement phase of the EU. And the idea is to get the 6 countries of the Western Balkans into the European Union at a later stage. At the moment, the front runner are Montenegro and Serbia, and that's followed by Albania and Northern Macedonia, and then it's Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina. In part of the 2018 enlargement strategy package, the European Commission also launched 6 flagship initiatives, and these flagship initiatives are aimed at improving the structural reform of these countries. And one of these flagship initiative, it's called the rule of law and judicial independency. And what that flagship initiative indicates is that these 6 countries of the Western Balkans have a serious issue when it comes to rule of law. And the idea is that these countries should reform the judiciary and independent institution, thereby they would be able to uphold the rule of law. However, the issues are quite a lot more complex than that. And in some of the countries of the Western Balkans, the EU has already started to kind of do some kind of an experiment how the rule of law reform should look like and how that should be conducted. So the country that they have already started is Albania, and in a way also in the other countries. And part of this paper is to kind of explain a little bit the dynamic and what it's going on in terms of the EU-driven reform in Albania and how that might be replicated in other European countries. At the moment, Kosovo is being suggested to follow the case of Albania, and that is because in Kosovo, in the last 10 years, there's been the EU mission for rule of law, which called EULEX, which is helping Kosovo to establish independent institution. However, the EULEX mission will be terminated and should have terminated last year, but it has been given a 2-year extension. And following that, it will likely follow the Albanian model, but it's not quite sure whether that will be the case. So just to sort of jump in, and I've prepared a bit of a PowerPoint here to kind of give you an idea. So I hope you can see the presentation. So some of the issues with the rule of law overall in the 6 countries of the Western Balkans can be characterized in 3 kind of main areas. So one, it's related to the weak justice system as well as law enforcement. And the European Union has very much kind of identified the issues with the rule of law around these 3 areas. So some of the issues here relate are that the judiciary is independent as well as law enforcement, and they pretty much are sort of an arm's length of the public as well as the politicians. And very much there is a lot of political interference when it comes to judicial appointees as well as to operation. Now, the political system is also characterized as sort of captured by either a small group of politicians, hence why I call it a hybrid regime, because it's a bit difficult to identify or at least to distinguish whether it could be interpreted as authoritarian or semi-authoritarian or hybrid regime. The fact that in the Western Balkans very much we have elections, but they are not fully fair, as well as they are not sort of taking place how they would take in a proper democracy. Probably the best description would be to say hybrid regime. Now, the political system very much it's closely linked, and it's very much kind of maintained through a close link with business as well as with organized crime. And what they do is they sort of indirectly manipulate the political system, and they do change the election rules pretty much every election cycle. We also have media as well as civil society, but the issue with them is that they are they're not funded very well, and they very much depend on EU funding. And the government at the moment, now, if you're familiar with the Hungarian model, they pretty much follow that model. Now, moving on to the... So corruption plays quite a major role when it comes to the rule of law issues. And for instance, to take in the case of Albania, corruption has kind of improved a little bit in 2013-15, but then in the later stages it has kind of gotten worse, and that is very much impacting how the rule of law should function as well as independent institution. And corruption is viewed by the EU not only in Albania but throughout the Western Balkans as one of the stumbling block to make progress when it comes to progressing further into the European Union. Now, the one to kind of note is that the legal framework, both on corruption as well as in the institutional infrastructure, are very closely followed by what the EU suggested, but their implementation is very poor. Now, Albania in 2014, it became an EU candidate country, and part of it, they gave 5 key priority areas which they need to do in order to progress and thereby join the European Union. It's to make reforms in public administration, in the judiciary, to fight against organized crime and corruption, and to uphold human rights. Now, corruption, it's very much kind of put in all of them. Now, one of the key kind of things that they are trying to do as a way to strengthen the rule of law is to reform the judicial system. And what happened is that the judicial system, it's highly corrupt. And in a survey which was conducted in 2016, the Albanian citizen noted that the judiciary is the most corrupt institution and the one that they had very much kind of had to deal with, or they had to pay money in order to get favorable verdict against them. And the judicial system has also been quite a bit of an issue for foreign direct investment in Albania as well as in the Western Balkans. And in Albania, very much any foreign business that comes to the country, they will only agree that any legal dispute should be dealt in international arbitration court, because they kind of don't trust the system. And we can see sort of a similar pattern throughout. Now, given these kind of brief issues, what happened was that Albania in 2016, with a lot of pressure from both the European Union as well as the United States, they passed a new package which was aimed, which is called the judicial reform. And what that did is they amended 1/3 of its constitution, in total 45 articles. And what this judicial package kind of entailed, or what its main issue was to re-evaluate the whole judicial system in the case of Albania. So the first thing that they did is they established 3 institutions, and one of them is called the Independent Qualification Commission. And here by the Albanian constitution derive the powers, and you have EU and US magistrate that take part in the evaluation process. Then you have also the international monitoring operation team that kind of does the administrative work in terms of collecting all of the data that is needed, and that is done by Albanians, but very much closely supervised by EU as well as US. And there were two new institutions that were introduced, and that one is the Special Anti-Corruption and Organized Crime Structure, and the National Bureau of Investigation. Now, the National Bureau of Investigation hasn't started work yet, but it's very much modeled around both the United States FBI as well as the UK Serious Fraud Office. Whereas the Special Anti-Corruption Organized Crime Structure, they started work last year, and so far it is having some kind of an impact because it has brought into justice a few cases. Now, to give you a bit of an overview in terms of what this vetting process is about, well, the whole justice system in Albania has nearly about 800 judges as well as prosecutors. And what the vetting process as part of the judicial reform it's doing, it's vetting all of these 800 justice. And what they are aiming or what they are, or how the criteria is operating is that they are being reevaluated based on their asset background as well as their professional integrity and how they have assessed. Now, so far, nearly half of the justice as well as prosecutors that have been reevaluated. So my figure, I try to take them yearly. In January, nearly 286 prosecutors and judges were reevaluated, and half of them were dismissed or they voluntarily resigned, and the majority of them could not identify and could not kind of justify the asset that they had in their name, and therefore, it was viewed that they are kind of engaged in corruption or so forth. They are not yet being prosecuted on this, but I assume that will be the next test of the justice system. Now, there are some issues when it comes to this implementation of this, and this is kind of what is creating a lot of issues, is that the justice system, while it's going through a reevaluation process, is very much in collapse because the Constitutional Court hasn't been operating in the last 3.5 years because 7 out of 9 justices could not pass the vetting process and they were deemed inadequate. But the side effect of this is because it has created the condition for the government as well as other public institutions to violate the rule of law because they could take decisions that are unconstitutional and you do not have the tools to kind of counter it. The same issue is also with the Supreme Court because only 4 out of 19 justices could not pass the vetting, and therefore it was kind of shut until a new justice can be brought in. Now, the downside of it is that nearly 35,000 cases up to May are still waiting to be adjudicated. So that is kind of the downside. So given what is going on in Albania, there are some countries in the Western Balkans that are kind of fearing to do this because in my sort of the justice system might be in the collapse. But then on the other hand, you could see that if it is that problematic, then one way or another has to be done. Now, the issue and the effort here that the EU is trying to do in hybrid regimes such as in the Western Balkans to enhance the rule of law is problematic in a way because the governments as well as the policymakers are not so much interested in to making the rule of law as part of their daily life, but is very much sort of how to please the EU and international institution on paper, and that therefore should be done. Now, another sort of conditions it's the issue is that some of these countries in the Western Balkan have sort of been democratized backwards, because the communism collapsed in 1990. They already started to have elections, but without any kind of how the institutions should be functioned. So, for instance, in the case of Albania, Albania never really had an independent institution since it kind of got its independence from the Ottoman Empire nearly 110 years ago, and that kind of creates some of the legal issues. But I'll leave it there, and I look forward to hearing your comments. And I'm kind of still, the paper that I'm hoping to bring for your journal would also include Kosovo in a bit more detail, because at the moment I've just gathered all the data on Albania, and I'm still working on Kosovo. And one point, or at least what I'm hoping to get some feedback, is kind of what theory might fit best for the journal to explain some of these dynamic. I mean, I have some ideas, but I look forward to your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ande, for this interesting presentation, and thank you all these three presenters today. So I will leave the floor to Jonathan for commenting now. He's a commentator of this panel. Then we will follow with the questions and answer session. Please, Jonathan.
Thank you, Aigen, and thank you, Sebastian, Vito, and Andy, for your papers. So while I'm talking, if others participating just want to put their questions using the chat box, just kind of using the chat function, and Aigen will gather them and then call on you or just read them to the paper presenters. So my comments here are geared primarily with an editor's eye, as in what I think the papers might need to do in order to kind of make the next step of being submitted to a journal, and then hopefully successfully going through the peer review process. So just kind of keep that in mind. I think I enjoyed all three papers. I learned a lot from them, because they're all on cases of which I have no familiarity. So it's always interesting to read stuff about and learn something new. So I want to thank the paper presenters for that. I think the other thing to emphasize is this is very interdisciplinary panel as well. It's also kind of regionally diverse, but it's also interdisciplinary. So we have Sebastian's paper, which is I think drawing. I would say, so for me personally, I kind of grew up as being trained as a political theorist in Canada in the 90s, and I really liked seeing how Sebastian drew on a lot of literature that was kind of familiar to me in kind of my graduate training, but applying it to a completely new case, right? So he's drawing on some of the multicultural political theory, such as Iris Marion Young and James Telledy's work, and kind of that was critical of what I would call the difference-blind approaches that we associate with liberal egalitarianism. So very much some of these political theory debates, they really kicked off in the 90s, but kind of carry on to today. But applying it to the case of Colombia. And so I guess it's both a question and a comment here for Sebastian. And so I don't know enough about the case to offer kind of feedback on whether or not the points you raise work, but I think the general claim, I think, to me sounds very strong, in the sense that you're making a pluralist argument that a variety of cultural imperialism in this context is a form of injustice, and that injustice legitimates a self-determination claim for the minority, or in this case, indigenous community within the Colombian state. So one kind of comment on this, because as I said, I kind of grew up in Canada and did my master's degree in Canada, then went to the US. And even just kind of moving from Canada to the US, some of the theory didn't really cross the border all that well. And so I'd see attempts, for instance, to kind of take Telledy and Taylor's work and then apply it to the case of race. And I think one way of putting this kind of is different kinds of diversity often raise different claims. And so one thing I'd kind of press you to think about is, are there a plurality of pluralisms? Like, what's what's different in the case you're looking at compared to the ones that Young and Taylor and Tully are looking at with requested diversity claims, and how might that problematize some of their assumptions also about what kind of counts as a claim of cultural imperialism or cultural injustice? That doesn't mean that the claim for pluralism or kind of cultural imperialism is wrong, but I think often when we move to new cases, we discover perhaps the limits of theories or kind of potential problems in simply applying it. And I think that can also then strengthen your paper because it then makes clear some of the value added. So my comment to you would be to really think a little bit about how the theories perhaps hit limits when we kind of look at it in this case. So most of your time spent critiquing what I call a difference blind approach that seems to be also at the case in Colombian constitutional cases, but perhaps also thinking reflectively on how pluralism may have to modify itself when it moves to a new context. I think that's very much in the spirit of both what Iris Marion-Young saw her work as doing, and also Tully. I don't think either of them see their theories as kind of comprehensive. They see them as working on a particular context, and then what changes when it's projected into a new context, I think, is also an important question to raise. So Vito, I enjoyed your paper very much on this kind of question around the Bougainville independence referendum in Papua New Guinea. I'm going to comment this, that your presentation foregrounded two things that are really buried in the paper that I would really encourage you to almost reframe the paper around. You spent a lot of time talking about gender in your presentation, and there was very little mention of gender in the paper. I went and checked, and I actually just did a quick word search because I didn't see that in the paper. And then I was like, oh, it's mentioned only once. And I'm like, to me, that's actually the most interesting discovery. And then I would reframe it around that. And then the Habermas part you mentioned very quickly in passing, but again in your presentation, it comes so clear that this is a really fascinating case of kind of deliberative consensus constitutional making at work. And so my big comment is, because when I was reading through the paper, the future studies methodology, I kind of saw it. I saw what you were trying to do as in here's these 4 different drivers, and I want to look at each one. I was a little worried that it wasn't clear to me if this is a causal model, like this is causing this kind of change, or if it's an evaluative model in terms of here's how we want to evaluate each of these factors when we're looking at hybrid constitutional making. And so my kind of pre-workshop comments were to clarify that. But I actually think the paper that's sitting here is actually one that has something very interesting to say about gender and consensus, deliberative consensus making. That may turn you to a completely different literature, because I think my immediate response is that there have to be a turn to some kind of feminist constitutionalism to kind of think through, think through what are the implications of assigning strict sex or gender roles for people within a constitution. In one sense, it kind of immediately, right off the bat, obviously creates equal participation in one sense, but I can see very quickly feminist critiques arising about the essentialization of gender or kind of questions of access to different places or kind of participant roles in constitutional making. So I think that, but I honestly think that would be my big comment is like that's the paper. Like that's a really fascinating case you've discovered. And then for Andy, so I think your paper really has 2 parts. And the first half, and again, I'm going off the stuff that I read as opposed to presentation. The first half's an analysis of the rule of law. And the second half looks at these 2 cases in the Western Balkans, Albania and Kosovo, and kind of looks at this. And so as I was reading it through, it almost read disjointed. And so there's basically 2 ways you could address this. So one is you would need to add a 3rd section that brings back the rule of law section from the first to really unpack, after we've looked at these 2 cases post the tail, what is it about this turn to rule of law that's being problematized or called into question? So that's one way you could do it. I actually think a second way you could do it, I think in your presentation, I think kind of drives this home, because I think it's really what your paper is about, is that the EU, and it's a broad crisis we're facing. It's not just these cases. We can see it in the case of Hungary and Poland and other member states right now, is that the EU is essentially unable to respond to rule of law backsliding in all of these hybrid regimes. And so I would suggest that perhaps reframing the paper that way, as here are two other cases of this, and what do we learn from these cases, would really kind of give the paper a bit more punch. Now, again, that might mean that you can kind of condense the history of rule of law, perhaps down to a few paragraphs. And we've actually published a fair bit recently in GlobeCon, so I kind of encourage you to go look at our back catalog on kind of the case of Hungary and Poland as well, and look at those cases and kind of see how they're looking at the rule of law backsliding problem, and then say, what do we learn by looking at these two new cases? Like, how that would give the paper a bit more topicality, and also literature. So that'd be my suggestion for that paper. I'll turn it over now to Aigen and to the audience to see what the questions are.
So thank you very much again for all this presentation, and Jonathan added a detailed comments for you. I hope that you will find it very useful. So now we can start the question and answer session now. Please feel free to join us to contribute to the discussions. Now I see Gaurav has raised his hand. Please, Gaurav, you can, yeah.
Thanks, Aigen. I had some quick comments for Sebastian and for Andy. So Sebastian, I think you're onto something super interesting that touches on questions of religious freedom and indigenous cultural protection. So I'm curious about how you think starting from different normative baselines about the interests that are at stake changes our responses to some of these questions. So I'm curious about whether you think that starting from a position that holds dear the promotion of individual autonomy might result in an incommensurate tension with minority or indigenous cultural rights protection. My second comment would be that, I mean, since I haven't read the paper, I mean, I can just only sort of comment from what I heard. It was not immediately clear to me how the indigenous legal system was interacting in this case with the broader legal system. So I don't know if that is something that you speak about, you know, the idea of a legal pluralism. And I'm curious about your thoughts on the idea or the sort of the theoretical framework of interculturality, which looks to be a sort of, you know, a transverse axis of public policy. You know, it's like a strategic process of integration that on the basis of things like, you know, social, cultural, political, and economic equality. And, you know, it seeks a gradual promotion of the spaces of interaction, dialogue, cooperation, mutual acknowledgement, understanding, and looks to bring about some kind of peaceful coexistence of seemingly disparate systems. So I'm curious about whether this figures in your analysis. And for Andy, I'm curious about what are the kinds of institutional mechanisms that Albania needs to develop that have come about from these oversight talks, and what is the role that you see for the EU in this oversight mechanism? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gaurav, for these comments and questions. Please feel free, Andy and Vito or Sebastian, to add your thoughts about this.
Should I go first?
Yes.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Jonathan for his comments, and I'll just kind of react very briefly to that. And then I will ask the questions. I answer to the questions. So one of my main interests with the article is to first of all, so this is within a project in which what I want to say is multiculturalism is a political theory that doesn't really have dealt with indigenous peoples. And today, when we talk about multiculturalism, is often thought of national minorities within, let's say, Western European countries, or like national minorities within the framework of Western European countries, or with immigration. Those are kind of the questions that are mainly addressed with multiculturalism debates. And I want to bring back these questions about indigenous peoples, because they are still big issues about justice. And on top of that, what I want to say is, when scholars look at indigenous peoples within the liberal multiculturalist framework, it is very often that they look at the United States, Canada, Australia, like Anglo-Saxon contexts, and Latin America, and then if it goes further than that, it goes like Southeast Asia, maybe Africa, but Latin America is often not looked at as if maybe I think maybe it is assumed that what is said about North America applies similarly to Latin American countries, or if it is so different that it's better not to mention it. So like maybe someone else has to go and study that. So what I want to say, what I want to do is to bring these kind of cases into the public eye and try to do some analytic work on kind of normative issues that appear with indigenous peoples in Latin America. So that's kind of what I want to say. These kind of cases brings this is kind of what I think might be new. It doesn't really, I'm not that much interested in testing those theories, but maybe using them to analyze the kind of cases that appear in Latin American contexts. So and now to these questions that were posed. So a little bit about the relationship between the system, like the law, the legal pluralism that exists in the country. So Colombia is one of the, in Latin America, is one of the countries that has the most autonomy for indigenous peoples in the region. So the indigenous peoples who are territorially united, they have broad autonomy to use customary law as long as they observe certain very minimal constraints. That is, that kind of some sort of rule of law, like similar cases are treated similarly, and that physical punishment or torture or harm and respect for life is ensured. This is kind of the minimal requirements that indigenous peoples have to observe. On top of that, they have full-fledged autonomy. So so if you are a non-indigenous person who goes into the territory, then you will be judged. If you commit a crime according to their standards, you will be judged according to their own customary law. If you go out of the territory and you commit a crime outside the community, you might be sent back to the community and you will be judged within the community. Same with educational system. They have their autonomous educational system. Economic system, like property, is communal property. So basically, it works as a there is, I mean, the relationship between the state and these communities looks much more as a federal relationship, even though the country is not a federalist country. So apart from minimalist requirements of respect for a minimalist conception of human rights, there is broad self-determination rights. And this says a little bit about what the goal is with this institutional arrangement. So if interculturality is understood as a project in which in the future there will be some sort of integration, social integration, something of the sort of, let's say, as you see in some European countries, let's say in Belgium, in which you have Flanders and the Walloon region, or in Spain with the Catalans and the other autonomous regions, in which there is cultural difference, but you can perceive kind of a shared cultural norms. This doesn't seem to be what is intended in Colombia with indigenous peoples, because there is very little normative common ground. So, so there is no, for instance, there is no requirement to learn Spanish in this. There is no requirement to follow a common curriculum if there is schools and they have to be schooled in certain in a certain way. There is no requirement that there is a unified curriculum. So I wouldn't say that in the future there will be the tendency of cultural convergence. So there is no integration. So the project is not about integration. The project is about giving political autonomy to these peoples, and by doing that, ensuring that the relationship between these two, let's say, communities supersedes the history of unjust relationships between these two. Economic integration is also not foreseen. So it is a paradigm that that differs from integration or interculturality as it is sometimes understood. It looks like much more like separation. Like let's have these different communities living separately in kind of respectful terms, meaning by that, like, we don't interfere too much on each other. And I think with that I kind of respond to the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for your remarks. So we can follow with Vito. Would you want to react to Jonathan's feedback and then Gaurav's question, Vito?
Yeah, I think I had to say something. It's the most expected. Okay, so I like to have fun when I'm writing. And so I wrote this paper probably, I don't know, probably a few months ago, 7 or 8 months ago. And then I've been working on this project with this incredible female researcher, public lawyers in Scandinavian countries and in Australia. And we were working exclusively on the role of genders on institution making. And so for the past 3 weeks, when I was working on these things, I noticed the connections of gender but the paper was already written, so I didn't have enough time, as you know, to change it radically. That's explain why. But no, I take the things board. I think that I would enjoy to write it again and in using the gender as one of the elements, and then focus on that connections between deliberations and the role of women. Now, said that, I spent a bit of time on these questions. Why don't we have more women in our political systems, in our institutions? Why don't? Okay, so strength is not an issue. Okay, so we don't need strength. So that's one of the things, the patriarchy, all the narrative. Why we need the ability to articulate narratives, and women are slightly better to do that than men. So there is all this narrative which were explored in the last years. And yeah, so yeah, that's exciting. I'm going to do that things and then send it to Habermas to see what he says about it. Yeah, that's my response. But it will be a lot of work. And this is a 12,000 word papers. I'm pretty sure I can find a space somewhere else in my book, maybe. But yeah, okay. So the big work. And what can I ask you? Can you ask me the questions again? Because I think I lost that I answered everything. So do I need to ask something else?
I think you have asked. You have answered everything.
Really?
Unless you don't want to add anything else.
No, I think it's fine. I mean, if you read the papers, it's about the methodology of future studies. The future studies is effectively come out is try to describe how the constitution changed. And so there are graphics and all that sort of thing, which I don't use. I select the elements which I think are important, and then I let the reader work out how they play together. Oh, come on, I'm biased, as you know, because I try to say something, even if I try to be objective. So the tendency is, I did like the role of genders, though I didn't push it too much on that. And yes, and there's also something which is enjoying doing, not to focus on the constitutions as a static element, which 90% of my colleagues do, because I find that soul destroying. But the dynamics of the future study methodology, which allowed individuals to create their own game when they produce the narratives, is the one I favored when I'm writing about constitutional law. Whether this might work for this paper, probably not. I would just use the focus in gender, which would be much more fun. Okay, there is an element that why I've not done it, why I've not done it. Okay, there is, it's really practical. So I worked for the past 2 years with this fantastic group of women. We produced these special issues for the Royal Studies in which we discussed the role of women, but there was just 2 males, and there are huge amount of questions about your sexual preferences to come out of this kind of activities, and that explains why I thought I should not push these things further. But okay, I'm going to do it anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. It was really interesting. So also now it is your turn, Andy. You can react to Jonathan's comments, and then you can also note your thoughts about Gaurav's points. Please.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the comments and feedbacks. I totally agree with Jonathan that some kind of third section is required to bring it in. And I totally agree, and that's something that I plan to work on rewriting the paper. And of course, it also makes sense to cut the first part. In terms of what I try to achieve, and I think it's a valid point in terms of, in my paper, I have to write what these 2 new cases bring in. But what I try to say, or at least I try to identify, is that in the literature, when you look at the Western Balkans or overall, the narrative is sort of that there's a rule of law backsliding. However, the question, or at least what I try to bring into this paper, is to say, well, in both of these countries, there wasn't anything improved that is currently backsliding. So I'm trying to sort of show through the history that it really never was sort of independent as such, or there isn't really a institution history where one can fall back in terms of say, okay, so at the moment we have a backsliding of it. But I agree, and I will definitely look into the literature to bring that more into the forefront. And I agree that a third section is needed to also kind of make a contribution how these 2 cases will fall in the overall argument. And there are some similarities with some of the literature on Poland and Hungary, especially in terms of the reform that they did in the judiciary prior to entering the EU. And now we could see that sort of backtracking into it. In terms of the question, it's kind of an interesting discussion in terms of what the EU as well as other international, such as the United States, would do once they leave. Well, at the moment, that's very much seen in Kosovo, because the EULEXA, which is a European initiative, they've been there for 10 years, but some of the issues that they also encountered are very closely linked to corruption. So we shall see how that kind of work out. However, in the case of Albania, there's a bit of more legitimacy because the system does not enjoy the same kind of trust that in some of the other Western Balkans countries you might see, and therefore the legitimacy of the EU and US being involved in the evaluation process, it's kind of more highly regarded, or there is a bit of more trust. Having said that, you could also see some sort of friction in terms of their involvement, because sometimes they are also viewed as being biased for the government, and hence it's this whole literature on authoritarianism that is being sort of kept for the issue of stability, especially in the Western Balkans. But I think it's something worth kind of explaining in the paper, if it might help for the reader, or kind of make a comment. And I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. I think, yeah, Vita wanted to add something. Please, Vita. Please unmute.
Yeah, I am. Okay. One must do it. Come on. There must be one every meeting who does that. So it's a question for Andy. Have you? It just it's fascinating because I have close connections with Montenegro in particular. But the questions there is: have you read the literature about the role of the patrimonial state? Because you know the narrative there. The more we try to squeeze those states, the less likely is that to produce the result. So a patrimonial state will become stronger when its resources are taken away from it. So it's the situation with Sicily. The Italian state have been trying to stop mafia for the past 100 years, at least 150 years, and the situation does not improve at all.
I've looked a little bit at that, but that's something that I'm sort of puzzling in terms of how you kind of have to bring it into the literature. What I'm at the moment looking into, I'm sort of looking at the social contract and how one can fit into this, because the whole question is, okay, so you're doing this reform, you're asking for some legitimacy, but then how can you sustain it in the long term? It's not just sort of, because at the moment you see kind of a massive intervention by the international community, but then how can you maintain it into the long term? I mean, some of the literature that we see from the Nordic countries in particular, how they maintain their fight against corruption in the last 100 years or so, was sort of not only with one specific major intervention, as we can see in the Western Balkans, but it was with a lot of indirect policies, which then they gave that sort of, they built a proper social contract. And therefore, one, then it's kind of said, okay, so I'll pay my taxes because I know that I'm going to get the service. I know that I'm going to get my day in court and so forth. But in these countries at the moment, you don't get that, because, half of the people don't even pay the taxes, because they say, well, why should I pay the taxes? Because if I want to get some kind of, I just pay someone a bribe and get it done and get it in the moment. So this kind of also enters into the whole overall culture issues when it comes with the rule of law. My only issues at the moment is, because I'm looking at this intervention, is that I see that in the language that the European Commission uses, or the EU, they don't quite seem to get the local context for some of these issues. So for instance, they talk a lot about backsliding of it, but then the real issue is, has it really backslided? So was it somewhere in history good, where at the moment we can kind of go back to that kind of thing? So these are some of the questions that I'm raising, but you make an excellent point in terms of patrimonial state, and I agree, and I've looked at it. But in terms of kind of communicating something that is worthwhile, I think in the paper, and then I'm also looking forward to the editor's comment, I want to come up with something to say a bit more sustainable. So what happened after this major intervention? So how can we then maintain it? And probably the social contract that the Nordic countries have employed might be something worth exploring in the literature. But thank you very much, Vito.
Thank you very much, Andy. Does anybody else have any questions, comments? Please feel free to add. If not, I think Jacob has comment here. Please, Jacob, feel free to add them.
Oh, wait, it looks like we have one person. Oh, Joe, do you want to go first?
It's up to you, Joe or Jacob, please.
No, you go first, Jacob. I assume there wasn't enough time, and then I realized there was. So, but there's really only one of us, so I'll step back and let you do it.
Mine's quite quick and sort of in the spirit of Jonathan's comments of thinking about how to revise these for publication. First of all, 3 great presentations, and thank you. I learned from each of them. I just want to say one interesting feature they all share is each of them is sort of based around a particular instance and applying an idea from that's relevant in general to global constitutionalism to that particular instance. And one question you want to ask yourself as you develop the paper is, what is the broader importance to that theme for scholars, right? So we have a sort of a paper on multiculturalism, a paper on secession independence, and a paper on rule of law. And there's sort of 2 ways to do this. One is to say, well, there's this established literature. Here's an instance that develops or nuances it. Another is a paper that has sort of a second act, or maybe even a more significant act, that is, here's how this scholarship needs to be revised. And you need to ask yourself which of these you're trying to execute. I would observe that to a paper that's especially strong will have this second type of element where we'll make a general contribution to the literature, building off the particular case, the particular kind of instance that is of interest to the author. And I think as a paper matures, that will often become clearer and clearer what that general contribution is. And I would say the strongest papers do, in a very robust way, not merely in a here's one paragraph at the end way, make that sort of general contribution. I think one interesting shared feature with each of these is just not being quite as familiar with papers as Jonathan. It seemed to me that they were still evolving in that direction of maturing into figuring out how they're going to make that more general contribution to each of their each of their themes, moving beyond the case study. Now, you can also have a very strong paper that is about the particular instance, but I would say the strongest papers, or the papers that are of the greatest interest to scholars, are ones that use that as a springboard to that more general point. That's all. I think we should have time for Joe's comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Please, Joe, can you add your comments?
Sorry, I'd switched my brain off. So I was curious to sort of think about these 3 papers going nicely together because of the whole issue of their problematization of the state. But I don't think I can really ask that at 1127. But I just thought I just wanted to say it was a really good thing that we got those 3 papers together because of the different ways in which they approach that question. I could have developed it with more time into some questions, but I think, as I say, at 1127, in the interests of a prompt conclusion, I'll just leave it.
Thank you, Joe. If you have any questions, we have last couple of minutes, or comments, feel free, please. Jonathan, do you want to add something as the chair of this session? Oh, Antje is here, so I will...
Well, at least I just wanted to say hi, and Vito, it was particularly great to finally see you. I mean, we've been corresponding for, yes, over so many years, and I really enjoy all the presentations. And unfortunately, in the afternoon, I have to walk over the vaccination center to receive my second jab. So I'll miss the afternoon, but I'll be, hopefully, everything going well, I'll be back tomorrow. So thank you very much, and my apologies.
Thank you very much indeed for being here, Antje, and hope your vaccination will go very well, and hope to see you tomorrow. I think we can close this session. Does Jonathan want to add something, because he was the chair of this session?
No, I think thank you again. I think we can just wrap up now. The only thing I'd add is our next meeting's at 3 o'clock UK time. Is that correct?
Yes,
So
we'll have a break now
Yeah,
and
that's right.
3 o'clock.
break. So we'd encourage you all to come back then as well for another exciting set of papers. But thank you for leading us off this morning, and maybe just a round of applause. You can use the applause emoji. What a wonderful feature that's been added to Teams. So, so thank you very much.
Oh, good. That's amazing. Thank you, guys. Thank
Thank you.
you.
See you a bit later. Goodbye.
See you at 3 o'clock. Bye-bye.